Today I'm going to be talking to Angela Pattison about some of the work she's involved with growing autumn chickpeas in this area at Narrabri Research Centre. Now, first thing I'm going to ask is for her to give us an overview on how the season went for her this year. Angela.
Sure. Well, as you know, the 2020 autumn was diametrically opposite to the last few years. It was really wet. So we did this autumn chickpea trial not to sow in autumn, but to sow kind of late January, mid-February. But at Narrabri, we had amazingly good rain. So the chickpeas got off to this roaring start and had quite a mild, wet March. So in terms of how did this season go? Well, amazingly. The plants were, by March, they were big and full of biomass and just loving life. It was an interesting challenge to see, okay, well, how are we going to manage the way these plants grow when they're accumulating biomass more and more, even right up into the time you want to harvest them, as opposed to when you're doing it in the opposite season where they kind of get to September and then they start to dry down and they stop producing biomass and they more just focus on their pods.
So you've seen your videos during the season of how the crop has grown. How did the harvest end up?
Very mixed for varieties, but good overall. So we had in there some commercial cultivars as well as some international ones, as well as some pre-breeding lines. And we got everything from almost 0 tonnes a hectare. And I think the highest one we got was about 4 tonnes a hectare equivalent. From our plot-based trial, which is really incredible. Obviously, it was a great growing season; it was perfect for them. But that spanned the full range of the genotypes. So it's very clear that there's a very important role for breeding to play in the harvest, the yields, but also the harvestability and the post-harvest quality of these chickpeas, because it varied a lot between the different lines and cultivars.
It gets a bit of an idea how early was the first crop ready to harvest as against the ones that probably never got to harvest at all?
I'd say you could probably go 3 months to harvestability from the earliest lines that we had. And the interesting thing is, I think I said this in the videos as well, in Australia, you know, the growing season over winter, you kind of go with roughly 4 or 5 months. But in India and in other countries around the world, they have a much smaller growing season normally. So what we're trying to do here isn't abnormal, it's just unusual for Australia. So to find a chickpea around the world that can complete its life cycle in 60 days is not impossible. They already exist. And I think that's the sort of route that we need to go down in terms of the research and development to be able to produce a variety that would be suitable and have its harvest ready to go when we want it to in this autumn growing season.
With the grain we did harvest this year, what can you say about the comments on the quality? Highly
varied, and it varied based on basically the time it took to finish its life cycle. And it being an indeterminate plant, it never really finishes anyway. But it's more the quality that you get at the end depends very much on whether the plant was trying to keep podding and flowering when you sprayed it out, or whether it had stopped flowering and stopped podding. So, for example, PBA Sema had largely stopped growing and it had definitely stopped flowering about a month before we had to spray it out. So it was still very happy, it was still very green and full of biomass, but it wasn't actively trying to produce more pods. And the bottom leaves had just started to turn. So we harvested this trial in June, or late July. We sprayed it out in kind of roughly June. And at that time, something like PBA Sema had largely stopped flowering and stopped podding. It was still a very happy plant, very green, hadn't died off at all. The bottom leaves had just started to turn. But none of the other commercial cultivars had really started to turn when we had to spray them out. They were still actively growing, and whether they were flowering or podding, they were at least actively growing. And so that meant that when we finally killed them, and it took a couple of sprays to get them dry enough to be able to harvest, that there was a lot of immature seed that was coming through at the end, and that some of that just gets graded out, but it's still got these bigger seeds that are quite green because they weren't quite mature when we had to spray the plant out, and there was quite a high proportion per plant where that's the case. So if you're asking me about the harvest quality, well, it was highly variable, but it depended on the genotype and whether that plant was still trying to pod when we sprayed it out. So I mentioned PBA Sema had sort of finished, and I think that both yielded the best of the commercial cultivars we tested in this particular season, and also it seemed to finish up, which meant the seed quality was the best. But we also had some breeding lines in there that were way earlier than PBA SEMA and had better harvest seed quality and better yields because it just finished earlier. And so the plant wasn't actively growing, and it certainly wasn't actively flowering when we had to spray it out in June.
I guess the issue is trying to spray out and harvesting in June. If we could get it back earlier in the year, it would be a much easier proposition.
Yep, very true. And there might be a few strategies that we can test with proper permissions to being able to bring it earlier as well. So we can obviously, doing at time of sowing is an easy one. There might be some chemical options, some hormone signals we might be able to use. But I actually think the most practical thing we can do is just breed cultivars that suit this system. So we don't need to apply a hormone to tell it to stop. It just intrinsically, that's the nature of the plant. It will stop on its own. But bringing forward the sowing date is an interesting option, and that will interact with the speed at which the plant naturally grows. So there's this sowing time by breeding research that needs to be done to really find the right combination that's going to work for this system.
And I guess that's the other question we'd ask, where's the future lay? You've covered some points like about breeding and what potentially may be in varieties and timing of operations and maybe disease issues. Is there any extra comments you'd like to put on some of those topics?
Oh, there's a bucket load of agronomic questions that this raises because it's straddling summer and winter seasons. So that means you get the summer weeds, pests and viruses for the first half of it, and you get the winter weeds, pests and viruses for the second half of the season. So not only are you creating a green bridge between the two seasons for all the other crops on the farm, but you're also going to have to deal with everything at some point in the crop. So it does create challenges. I don't think they're insurmountable challenges, and if they're challenges, if the yields of this system are what we think they're going to be, then it's well worth putting the effort in to figure out these challenges. But yeah, in particular, we found that the summer weeds were very competitive with the little chickpea plants. So that was a real challenge. And then at the end, you got the Heliothis and all the pests that are trying to get into the pods. And it's kind of in March and April when they're starting to pod. So you've got these pests that you wouldn't normally have to deal with in winter, not just Heliothis, other ones as well, that are causing a real problem because the weather's slightly more conducive to these pests. And then the green bridge problem is a very important one, and you can be very tempted when you see the potential yields, and we'll publish some of these results very soon, but SEMA, both in the 2019 and the 2020 season, SEMA yielded about 2 tonnes a hectare, and we know 2019 was an incredibly harsh season, so even with less water, PBA SEMA still does very well. So if you're thinking you can get 2 tonnes a hectare, even in a harsh season, because of the way that the temperatures are during podding, it's very tempting to think, oh, let's bang them in. But there can be very serious implications for the whole farm system if it's not planned for and the green bridge isn't considered.
I guess that's a fairly important point. We've got to take on the whole farm program. It's not just one crop. You've got to fit it in with everything else that happens on the farm in terms of management, disease control, and timing of operations becomes critical in all these combinations. Thank you very much for that. I think you've covered it very well. Thank you, Angela, for taking this time to talk to me today. Appearing on the screen now are harvest samples from the plots of 4 varieties we know and 1 new cross. Note there are green, late maturing seeds and small seeds in these samples.